Hello everyone and welcome to another Scots Whay Hae podcast, and I'm joined today by writer Graeme Macrae Burnet. Hello Graeme.
Hello Alistair, great to be here.
And we're going to talk about A Case of Matricide, the final novel of the Gorski trilogy, which is published on the 3rd of October on the Contraband imprint of Saraband. And before we get into A Case of Matricide, it might be worth talking about the trilogy as a whole and how it came about and how it's kind of progressed over 3 novels.
Well, it goes back quite a long way. It's quite a long story. The origins of the whole trilogy is the first novel is The Disappearance of Adele Badeau, which was published in 2014. Then there was the accident on the A35, and finally, as you've said, A Case of Matricide. And the books came about because I was visiting a friend many years ago in the Swiss town of Basel. All 3 books are set in the small town of Saint Louis in France, which is right on the Swiss border. And me and my friend walked across the border into Saint Louis, which is, as is described in all of the books, a very unremarkable small
Yes.
town of about 20,000 people. And we went for lunch in a place called the Restaurant de la Poste, which in the novels is called the Restaurant de la Cloche. And I think it's a case with all small French towns. There's one restaurant or brasserie which is the real hub of the town, the place where everyone goes for lunch, and they have their 3-course menu with a glass of wine or a glass of beer, and everybody goes there from the bank manager to the guys from the building site, and it's a very French thing. And this place, you know, the menus are chalked onto blackboards on the wall, and you could tell that everybody there is a regular and everybody knows each other, and you had this feeling that there was the petty rivalries and dislikes that people have for each other. And as a great fan of the Belgian writer Georges Simenon, who writes brilliantly about provincial France, I felt that I'd completely walked onto the set of a Simenon film. And I made a few notes. I wrote a few pages of description at the time. This was about 24 years ago.
Right.
And that scene always stuck in my head. And 10 years later, I went back to it and I just started developing what I'd seen there, and took that situation and I invented characters. And I invented the character of Adele Badeau, a waitress in the restaurant who disappears and kind of provides the momentum for the story in the book. And yeah, that's how the first novel came about. And because it was set in France and I'm obviously not French, I felt like I was writing a translation of a novel, and I was very conscious. I'm kind of pretty immersed in that sort of mid 20th century French fiction of post-war fiction of Sartre and de Beauvoir and Simenon, and I was almost writing in the style of a translation of a novel of that kind. And so then I invented this French writer called Graeme Burnet, who's the actual, or claimed to be the actual author of this first novel, and I posed as the translator of the book, which led then to Graeme Burnet having written another 2 novels, The Accident on the A35 and The Case of Matricide, which were only published after his death by suicide. So yeah, that's the kind of origin story, as people suddenly, everybody's talking about the origin stories of things now, so that's the origin story of the trilogy.
So I'm guessing there was no idea that this would be a trilogy when the first book was written, definitely written, but even published.
Well, when I was writing The Disappearance of Adele Badeau, I didn't for a minute. I mean, I'd just turned 40, and the one thing I'd ever wanted to do in my life was to publish a novel. And I thought, okay, come on, it's time. I knew I've been writing all through my 20s and 30s, but I thought it's now time to really commit to something. And if I'd been thinking in a sort of commercial way, a Scottish guy writing a novel in an unremarkable French town, it's not a very commercial, doesn't seem to have a lot of commercial potential. I didn't really think it would be published, even in English. So never mind thinking about, going on to write a trilogy of books.
Which would be translated themselves.
Well, I mean, that's that one of the best things or weirdest things is that then the books have been picked up by a French translator and sort of translated into their original language. And I've actually gone to Saint Louis to present the books there, which is quite a strange experience because I'm extremely rude about the town and about the people of the town. But they seem to have taken it in quite good spirit. So yeah, I certainly never expected the book to be published. It was published by Saraband, picked it up pretty quickly after I sent it to them. But I certainly didn't expect it to be translated. And having said that, even before the LBO was published, I had started writing a draft of the accident on the A35.
Right.
Some of the material I'd written ended up in the first book, because I ended up making the character of Gorski more prominent in the first book than he had been in the first draft. And Gorski, although I now call it the Gorski trilogy. Yeah. Gorski, I should say, is the detective character in the book Georges Gorski. He's a bit of a plodder, and he's kind of, maybe when he was younger he had kind of ambitions to go and work in a more exciting environment, to go to Marseille or Lyon or Paris, somewhere with like dramatic, glamorous crimes. But he's chief of police in Saint Louis, and I think he feels he's kind of reached his level. This is his level of success, and he's comfortable with it, and he's not really a man of ambition. The Gorski sort of appears after about 50 pages of the first book. I didn't know he was going to come along and become the main character and the spine of the trilogy. And really it's the trilogy, to my mind, which I think of as one project now, it's kind of the story of Gorski. You know, that's what I think about it as. And after I'd written The Accident of the A35, I knew there would be one more book. And I hadn't exhausted it to my own satisfaction. And also I love a trilogy. I think people like a trilogy. Yeah.
I think that's true. I think some of the best texts come in trilogies, the completion of it. And I think with this, it really, you have to look over all three to see that it is Gorski's story. Because it's okay then that he comes in, not right at the beginning, but he stays for the whole three. Yeah. And so the character himself, how did you develop? You've talked about his kind of personality. How did you create him? How did you start to piece together a backstory and a life and all these things which come into it?
I never plan anything else there. Gorski appears in order to question the central character of the first book, Manfred Baumann, his kind of lonely outsider. So we first encounter Gorski through the point of view of another character, and then I just started writing scenes with from Gorski's point of view. So the point of view in the novel is divided between these two characters. I just feel my way along, and when you're getting to know a character, you're like, how is this character going to behave in this situation? And at the beginning you're not sure, and then the character behaves in a certain way. So now I know Gorski so well that even if you describe a certain scene to me that's never appeared in any books, I would know how he would behave in that scene, and how he's kind of socially uncomfortable. He comes from a kind of what we would call working class background. His father was a pawnbroker, and kind of in a sort of shadowy area between of illegality. And so Gorski becoming a cop was a kind of rebellion against his own father, and a kind of act of sort of social climbing. But he's always felt uncomfortable. He feels uncomfortable among people, the bourgeoisie, and he feels that his manners are not correct, and people are judging him.
There's a lot of neuroses going on with him, isn't there? I think that's fair to say, in all situations. Kind of almost, I guess it's the idea of belonging, and he's not sure where he belongs. Absolutely. I mean,
I think he feels that he does belong in Saint Louis, and yet, I gave him the name Gorski very deliberately because it's not a traditional French name, and it sort of signifies, we never really find out what his origins and his parents' origins are, but there's definitely a suggestion that his parents were immigrants to France. So again, there's that insecurity about not being properly from there, and people judging him for that. And
go back to Saint Louis being a real place. do you ever regret that you kept it a real place, or it was?
No, I mean it's really, I don't know what, I'm not really sure why, but it really anchors the books for me and all my books use very real geographical places. I use real street names, and the geography or the topography of the books is all pretty much correct. The strange thing, I've written these 3 books over a period of about 15 years, really, maybe a little bit less. And when I first visited Saint Louis, it was 10 years before that, and the books are set 20 years before that, in about 1980. So the Saint Louis that I'm writing about, which is still about 1980, is, but last time I visited was 45 years later, and even in the 20 odd years I've been visiting the town's changed a bit, and it seems a lot more affluent than it did previously. And so although the streets and the railway station and most of the bars and restaurants and hotels are pretty much as described, I do invent some locations. The Saint Louis of the novels is in some sense a fictional place. I mean, I project all sorts of thoughts onto the inhabitants of Saint Louis about social class and the stratification of the town. I mean, I don't really know what the social classes of Saint Louis are like and how they mix or don't mix, but I project that, and it's really it matters to me that it's a real place, but I don't suppose it really matters to readers, other than the few who maybe want to pay a pilgrimage and go and have lunch at the restaurant.
Or the people that live there. I mean,
yeah.
I can remember reading Mr. Alfred M.A., which is set in Glasgow, and thinking no one else outside of Glasgow, because it doesn't go up Sauchiehall Street or Buchanan Street, it's other streets that you would only know if you kind of knew the place that it was. And in terms of Saint Louis, you've created a kind of cast of characters as well, who there's a couple of sections just over a couple of pages where you give snapshots of what people are doing. What was that for? What was that to show that there are other stories going on here? You could have told alternative stories. I
really like the kind. I don't know if it's become more of a trend, the sort of short story collections where there are sort of tangential connections between characters who might flittingly see each other or pass each other in the street. And I think one of the things I wanted to do in writing a trilogy rather than a series of detective novels, to me the difference between a trilogy and a series is that there's a kind of interconnection between the novels, and because it's a small town, even in the previous books, characters kind of bump into each other all the time, and there's this feeling of claustrophobia that you can never escape the sort of scrutiny of other citizens in the town. And so the novel, the new Case of Matricide, opens, I kind of thought of it like a drone just hovering over the town, and there's like maybe like 10 little almost flash fiction pieces of various characters, some of whom we've met before in the other books, and some of whom are new, and some of whom occur more recur in the novel, and some don't. But yeah, I suppose I was trying to suggest this interconnectivity between people's lives in a small town like that, and also the connectivity between the previous novels. Having said that, and I mean, I remember very specifically when I actually started to write this novel properly. I went away for a week for a kind of writing retreat. Like, let's get the draft started properly. And I should have told you before, I never have a plan. So I just started writing that stuff, and I wrote it one morning. And I was like, oh yeah, this is quite nice. And also one of the things, the first 2 novels, the perspective, the chapters are split between the perspective of 2 different characters, and also the novels sometimes leave Saint Louis. I mean, the accident in A35 takes place also in the nearby town of Mulhouse, but in this novel, the perspective, we never leave the point of view of Gorski, and the novel never leaves the town of Saint Louis. So even what I realised as I was writing the book was like using these kind of little interludes where I kind of step out of Gorski's point of view. It provided, I think, a little bit of breathing space, almost like a sort of, this is the end of the first act, and oh, here's Madame Beck, the florist from downstairs. Oh, she's just preparing dinner for her husband or whatever, and then another character will see Madame Beck driving past in her little van, and so I mean, I think it became a useful sort of narrative device, punctuation wise, but it also allowed me to flit into other characters and just get away from Gorski for a minute, just give Gorski a little bit of a break.
Well, it gives these other characters a life outside of just relating to Gorski as well.
Yeah.
But you say you never plan. Were you surprised when, say, Adele turns up, or was that like, oh right? Okay.
I suppose I wouldn't be surprised at that, but I would be. What surprises me is, I mean, there's a bit in the novel. I mean, I'll give you an example. I was going to the library one morning, not knowing what I was going to write. I say going to the library because I work in the Mitchell Library, and that's where I go to do my writing, to instill some discipline on myself. And I was walking to the library, which is about 10 minutes from my flat, and thinking, I have no idea what I'm going to write today. And I got there and I faffed around as usual, and Gorski in the novel is living with his elderly mother, and this is his childhood, the apartment he grew up in, and I have a very, very clear picture of that in my mind. Every detail, I can see it. And on the table where the family eat their meals was a cruet set, and I thought, I'm just going to, as a writing exercise, describe the cruet set. And I describe it in absolute minute detail, and I'm not making it up because I can already see it.
Yeah.
But in doing that, a narrative, a bit of backstory came to my head, in which Gorski had a memory of, as a little boy, breaking the mustard spoon and covering up his crime.
Yeah.
And it's become, that completely came from nowhere, and certainly not through any kind of planning. But it becomes a sort of really important thing that runs through the novel, because it informs Gorski's relationship with his mother. Yeah. And I could never have planned that.
It's really interesting. I have a question that is, can we talk about the mustard spoon? Because I think it's a beautiful piece of writing. It is so intricate and kind of intimate, this little thing, and it leads on to, it raises questions of guilt and worth and memory, and how the smallest incidents in childhood can be carried for a lifetime. So that's so interesting to hear that you had this picture of the cruet set, but then did it start to take on all of these other things through the incident with the mustard spoon, let's say? No, I mean, it was like, I'm literally like,
here's a line of glue where it's been fixed, and I mean, it's I think, as you're kind of alluding to, it's like these minute details that stay with us. And this is a crime novel. I mean, and I've got no problem with this being called a crime novel. I was a bit more ambivalent with His Bloody Project, which, although it's a novel about a crime, I didn't feel it was a novel within the crime genre. And that's, I don't see that out of snobbishness. It's just the kind of novel I think it is. But this is a crime novel, although maybe not a typical one. I mean, crime novels are usually concerned with sort of dramatic and violent incidents, like murders and so on. But I'm always interested in the sort of drama behind these extremely what may seem very trivial incidents, the breaking of a porcelain mustard spoon, 40 years before, and how we, well, in this case, the character of Gorski has never quite got over the intense feelings of guilt of what he did. And these feelings of guilt, which, as I say, it informs his relationship with his mother, but maybe it informs his constant feeling of sort of paranoia and the feeling that he's being watched.
And it informs his relationship with his mother to the very time of the novel, where she's bedridden and ill, and we think she's beginning to kind of lose her memories and all these things, but it's still, he still thinks she knows, or she knows more than she's ever let on.
Yes, I mean, he says that quite near the beginning of the novel. I don't think it's a big spoiler.
No. I hope.
But no.
But a lot of the novel emerges through small details. You know, what people drink, what they eat, what they're listening to. And for you, it's getting these finer details. Is that part of the joy of writing, if that can be described?
Absolutely. I mean, and it's a lesson I always go back to Simenon, and how I've learned more about the process of writing, the craft of writing, I would say, than from Simenon than anybody. Simenon has got a fantastic ability to evoke a scene in a very economical way. He's not like Emile Zola, who will describe a scene at great length and in great detail. Simenon is like a sketch artist. There's a few quick lines of the pencil and you see it all. But he always hones in on a little detail that's unexpected, and it's that detail that, to me, brings the scene to life. And I suppose that's something I try to do. And when I've written, especially The Accident and this book, Case of Matricide, I went specifically to Saint Louis for that purpose, to observe and to. Becomes an active process, and we're not. I think it's easy to lose that skill because we're so. We've lost our ability not to constantly look at our phones, and the details I observe. It doesn't really matter if they're made up or not, but a lot of them are real, and I put them in, and to me, they add to the texture of the book, and hopefully they add to the texture feeling of authenticity, that these scenes are real and vivid, and it is really important to me. And I suppose it's something about the craft of writing that I value as a writer, and I value as a reader.
Yeah.
So when I'm reading something, I've just read David Gregg's book Columbus Bones. We're part of the Darklands series, which is, I think, a really exciting series. And I was reading this book, and I'm like, oh my! He nails it every time. This is a book about Vikings and monks in 11th century Iona, and every time he describes something, his use of language, he uses the right word, and his metaphors and use of figurative language. It's just like he gets it spot on. And when you get that wrong, it's like, oh dear. But it's brilliant, and I love that. I love that as a reader. And I suppose that's kind of what I'm aiming for too, for people to go, I can so see that. I can see it unfold in front of me. I can see that crew set. I can see Gorski and his mother sitting having their evening meal. And it doesn't matter if the picture in the mind of the reader is the same as the picture I have. It just matters that there is a picture. The same with the Restaurant de la Cloche in the books. It's like everybody has a picture of that. They'll see it in their mind's eye, their reader's eye. It doesn't matter if it's the same as the actual place or the place I see. It matters that they have a picture and they see the characters inhabiting these streets and these bars and so on.
And there's a sense of empathy as well. When I think we could all, when I was reading it, then suddenly I was thinking of things from childhood that you went, oh yeah, you hid that, or you stole that, or whatever it might be. That actually, in the big scheme of things, wasn't a big deal, but it remains a big deal, a kind of stain on your own consciousness.
I think this is why we read fiction. I mean, on one hand, you might read fiction, historical fiction. You might want to learn something about a historical period or a different country or culture. But I think largely, or maybe just speaking for myself, I largely read fiction because I'm looking to empathise with the characters and feel that I understand them psychologically, and these situations that they're in are situations I can relate to my own life. I mean, I read the extract about the Cruet set in at the Edinburgh Festival a couple of weeks ago. You were in the audience, and afterwards, when people were coming to get their book signed, and a lady, maybe early 60s, told me that she'd listened to that extract, and it reminded her of a moment when she had broken a teacup of her grandmother's prized wedding present tea set, and she'd not owned up. And then years later, she had inherited the tea set, and she broke another piece, and her mother was like, yes, oh, your grandmother, she always knew about that. And I was just like, it was like that. I was, as a writer, you can't, that's just gold, you know. Like, you've written this thing which you never planned to write, which I completely invented, and then it just rings so true for somebody, and it relates to an experience they had, and other people might be like, who cares about the mustard spoon? But I'm writing for, you write what you want to write, and you hope that it connects with some readers, and it's really rewarding when that sort of thing happens.
There's another example I want to bring up, and it's the cooking of the sea bass and fennel with his daughter. And really in that, it's about what's unsaid between them, I think. He kind of pretends that he can't cook. I might, if I'm getting this wrong, let me know, but pretends that he can't cook, and then he's delighted that she seems impressed that he has been able to cook. And I just find that was just such a lovely scene between two people who don't seem particularly close, or at least there's a difficult relationship there as well.
Oh, in fact, it's so nice that you. I mean, I love it when people notice these very uncrime novel-y scenes. As you say, Clémence is about 16, maybe 17, and she comes around once a week and brings some ingredients for her dad to cook, and Gorski kind of acts a bit like fool. I don't know what to do with this fennel, and he asks his mother, and she's like, "Braise it, you idiot!" And it's their way, because as you say, that he's in his late 40s and she's 17. It's a tricky time for kids to talk to their parents. So instead of talking directly, they communicate through this ritual of cooking a meal together. And I found that, I love to cook, and I love the sizzling of vegetables in oil, and you put it in the hob before, and there's a little moment where Gorski kicks the oven door closed with the toe of his shoe and kind of feels that he's quite cool. And I really enjoyed that scene. And sometimes when you're writing something, you feel that your characters are connecting and you're getting it right, and so it's really nice it's really gratifying when people bring up that stuff. But it's like they're not talking about. They don't talk about anything directly. Yeah,
it's not what did you do at college today or anything. Like
and then they said and because Gorski's mother is got some problems with her mental acuity, and Clémence because there's a silence, Clémence just talks about what's going on at school, and Gorski even, and we're in his point of view, is like, if it was just the two of them, it would be really awkward, but they're filling the silence in front of grandmother, and again it's like the drama of small things, and the sort of the tension between family members and how we behave and act, and I mean that in both senses. We put on an act. I'm reading a book which I picked up in Waterston's a couple of weeks ago called Forbidden Notebook. It's a 1950s novel by I don't know how to pronounce the name, Cespedes perhaps, and it's a novel. It's a very domestic novel. It almost takes place entirely in the apartment of the housewife, the woman writing the notebook, and it's all about the tension and between the son and the daughter and the mother and father, and it's a masterpiece. Masterpiece.
I was reminded before we started recording, we were talking about Kelvin. I was reminded of a scene in A Disaffection where the central character and his dad are doing the dishes side by side, and there's barely any communication, but there's so much going on between them. And I think that, there's quite a bit of that going on. And you said it's a crime novel, and it is a crime novel and a murder mystery, but is it one where the crime isn't to the fore, for example?
I think it's very much one where the crime isn't to the fore. I mean, all three books, I think they use the conventions of the crime genre, but as is probably already clear, what interests me is not the crime itself or the solving of the crime, but the effect of whatever incident it is, whether it's the disappearance of a waitress or the death of a lawyer on the motorway, as in the accident on the A35. So I'm really interested in how the characters are impacted by the events of the book. Having said that, I think it's also the most action-packed of the books. I mean, there's a strand of narrative where there's this kind of mysterious Yugoslavian guy stalking the streets of San Luis, and at the very beginning of the novels, Gorski is called to a local hotel by the manager, who's concerned because this guy has been staying in his hotel for like 4 days.
For too long.
And he's like, well, he must be up to no good, because why would anybody stay in Saint Louis for so long? Which is kind of a little bit based on my own experience of going there to do research for like over a week, and people going, why is this guy just wandering around the streets of our town? And then there's also a narrative of an elderly lady called Madame Duiman, who thinks that her son is going to murder her, and her son is a writer who has previously written a novel,
yes,
called At the Restaurant de la Poste. So you can get your metafictional heads around that if you can.
And thinks that the dog's been done in as well.
Yeah, she thinks that the son has murdered her dog. And there's also the narrative strand of Marc Theroux, the local cement factory owner, concrete factory owner, who's dropped dead in his office. So there's actually quite a lot going on in that. As a writer who struggles more with sort of narrative and structuring narrative, that was a big challenge for me, just trying to juggle these 3 strands of narrative. And obviously Gorski is the thing that brings them together, but also, you know, I'm trying to I suppose find out if these various strands are connected to each other. Is there any connection between the Slav and the death of Marc Theroux? You know?
I know that's part of the mystery, and you should say none of what Graeme has just said is a spoiler. These are all up front, and you know that's the thing.
This is the exposition of the novel,
And you talk a little bit about the relationship between Gorski and his mother, because it is a complex one that really is at the heart of the book.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to say too much, because I feel like there's a kind of point to what that is going on there, but I don't want to, if I say what the point is, then it loses its
okay, in a wider sense, does it tap into the fear that some of us have, that we all are destined to kind of become our parents in some way?
I mean, I think that's very much it. I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, Gorski becomes a cop in open defiance of, in order to differentiate himself and to follow a different path from his father. His father wished him to take on the shop, take on the family business, and Gorski instead joins the other side to some extent. So this was an act of rebellion for the young Gorski, and his here talking about the trajectory of his life, which runs through these 3 books. He finds himself back in his childhood home, and his mother is calling him by his father's name. So are you going to ask me about Emile Zola?
I am going to ask you about Emile Zola, because I have done a little bit of homework since we last.
It's just because it kind of relates to that.
So there's 2 statements actually, which actually refer exactly to what you've mentioned. So we'll maybe take them one at a time. One is the statement that people do not like policemen. And which I think a lot of people will be able to identify with, but it's interesting that that's in the book.
Right. I mean, it's not a sort of anti-police statement.
No. But
it's from the point of view of, like, I mean, I am a completely law-abiding citizen, and that, as mentioned in other occasions, I'd be a terrible criminal. But
well, even today I was driving, and a police van in front of me, and it indicated to go left, but actually quickly did a U-turn right, and I was like, what have I done? Immediately, I must have done something wrong. So always, in fact, last year, I just remembered this, I got pulled over. It was just a spot search that they were checking and everything. I'd forgotten where I lived. I'm a 54-year-old man, and they said, "Where are you?" And luckily, my mum was in the car, and she was going, "Yes, you live it." It was ridiculous. But I'm interested that it's in Gorski's mind when it's what he chose to do, that act of rebellion, knowing that actually people don't like me, therefore people don't like policemen, therefore people perhaps are not going to like me.
Well, I think maybe when he becomes a policeman, when he's a young guy, he's seen, there's a cop called Ribéry who he's seen around and who visits his father, and he looks up to Ribéry. And I think at that point Gorski would see the policeman as a sort of rather noble figure, and I think it's only later that he his wife Celine disparages the fact that he's just a cop, and he should be a lawyer or something more socially prestigious. But it's also that he becomes to realise that, just as you've described, even the most law-abiding citizens become uncomfortable in the presence of a cop because they begin to feel, well, what have I done wrong? You know, is it because I've paid my council tax late or whatever? Or, you know, I just inched over the speed limit. I smoked a joint when I was a student.
I was 16 years old. But it made me wonder, the police point of view of that, you know, what does it do when someone who clearly has done nothing wrong but acts like they have done something wrong? That must be, because that's your job. It's almost that's what you're defined by.
I think there's a difference between Gorski and a typical cop in a crime novel. You know, Gorski has these kind of thoughts, and I don't think that he's not an alpha male, you know, and he cares about what other people think. And he feels he's constantly humiliated and embarrassed. I think, you know, I don't want to name any other, you know, fictional detectives, but I don't think they're so troubled by such thoughts about whether they're popular or not, or whether, you know, they maybe even thrive. Some fictional cops actually thrive on their being the alpha male who walks in the bar and everybody falls silent and looks at their shoes, you know.
To take it to an extreme, Crockett and Tubbs and Miami Vice were plagued by these thoughts.
I mean, going back to Simenon, obviously Simenon is best known for writing the 75 Maigret books. And I'm a much bigger fan of the other 120 romans d'heure that Simenon wrote, the books not featuring Maigret. But if you look at the trajectory of Maigret, and Simenon was also not really interested in the outcome of the narrative, and he says so himself in the Maigret books, and the denouement to the Maigret books is often pretty cursory. But when Maigret makes his appearance in the very first book, which was written in 1930, Peter the Latvian, Maigret is a young cop. He's pretty macho and he beats up a suspect, and he's described as being muscular and sort of hewn from stone, and the character develops greatly over the intervening sort of 30-40 years that Simenon was writing these books. And my favourite Simenon Maigret book is called Maigret's First Case, which was actually written in the mid-50s, and here we get Maigret as a young cop, and he gets his first case. And what for the first time, at least in my experience of reading the Maigret books, we get inside Maigret's head and we feel his insecurity, because he has to go and question some very rich coffee merchants in their large Parisian townhouse. And Maigret comes from the countryside. His father was what do you call the guy who looks after the estate, you know. Anyway, he comes from the countryside, and so for him to go to question these social superiors, he feels insecure, and it's the first time you get that sort of look inside Maigret's mind, as not just as a cop but as a man with the sort of insecurities and concerns and worries that other people have. Yeah, absolutely. And that's very much where Gorski's coming from. Although he is a policeman, he's a man. You know, he's an individual with the insecurities and failings of, you know, other men. You know.
The other statement is, if you want to understand France, you must read Zola. Rougon Marquet, is that the
Rougon Macrae?
There you go.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned that I hadn't read it when we did the book festival.
Well, only because I asked for a show of hands, and you weren't alone.
Since then, I have dipped my toes into it and started to read it, and it's really interesting because it is full of relationships between sons and mothers and family and all that kind of thing. Why is Zola important to this book in particular, I think?
Well, I mean, there's a little thread of Zola runs through all the books. I mean, in the first book, young Manfred Baumann reads he's reading Thérèse Raquin, which is a novel by Zola outside his 20 novel cycle of the Rougon Macrae cycle, and he reads the preface, and he feels very liberated, because Zola is the sort of, obviously this is before existentialism, but he's the very much the anti-existentialist, because Zola believes that everything is determined by one's hereditary. Everything is blood and nerves, and hereditary, he says at some point, is like a law of gravity. There is no escaping it. And when he set out to write this massive 20 novel cycle, he's thought of it as an experiment. He thinks of himself as a scientific, and he's taking these characters and tracing their destinies in his mind in a scientific way. And I think that's all, kind of guff. But what interests me is the question of free will.
Yes.
And to what extent the characters behave with free will and have agency in their own lives. So when Gorski becomes a cop in defiance of his father's wishes, he feels like he's exercising free will. But over the trajectory of the 3 books, he ends up sitting in his father's chair of an evening, quite literally.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of taking that idea of, it's not predestination in the sort of Scottish Presbyterian sense, although it's kind of an interesting parallel now we think about it.
Yeah.
It's predestination in that you can never escape your upbringing or your environment. So with Zola, it's much more about heredity, but it's also about the social environment, and he writes these novels set in the most squalid slums of Paris. He's not an easy read, Zola, but having read quite a bit of Zola, I think he's a novel that's well worth reading, and tremendously powerful at his best. You often have to wade through tremendously long descriptions. That's also the purpose of the novel in the middle of the 19th century.
In that sense, he reminds me of a lot of the big Russian writers. Get through the fields of wheat and you can find the point.
Well, it's maybe a sidebar and you can cut it out if you want, but I just reread The Devils.
Oh, right.
I regularly say that my favourite novel and the greatest novel of all time is Crime and Punishment, and I will die on that hill, okay. So to speak.
You and I might have an Anna Karenina book off with you.
Okay. So I love Crime and Punishment. I've read it a number of times, and I thought I'm going to read. I had a reason to reread The Devils, and Jesus, it's a terrible book. It's way longer than Crime and Punishment, and you feel like it's only after about 500 pages that you feel you're beginning to get to what the story's actually about, and it's tremendously overlong, and it's got no real narrative thread, and it's structurally flawed, deeply flawed. But yeah, I spent 3 weeks reading it, and I did get to the end, so
Yeah, a lot of these books you feel there's a test. It's almost a test of endurance to get to the end.
But I think like Zola, Dostoevsky, probably like Dickens as well. I haven't really read much Dickens, but they saw themselves as people. They were documenting the social conditions around them, and Zola was very self-consciously doing that. So you will get a 6-page description of the workings of the French railway system and La Bête Humaine, or the accounting system of a large department store in The Lady's Paradise. And will go on for 6 pages, but you can kind of skim it a wee bit.
It's interesting to compare it to what we were talking about earlier about the detail in your book, and how it's important but it's concise. Whereas, you would think a modern day editor wouldn't allow any of this.
Absolutely. If only Dostoevsky had a proper editor. But it's also like the purpose of that sort of social documentation was overtaken by photography and by film. And so now if we want to find out about the conditions of an industry somewhere, we'll watch a documentary about it on BBC4. Or we watch a short film, a TikTok about it. So the novel doesn't take up that function, and it hasn't for the entirety of the 20th century. I think it began to look much more inwards to the psychology of characters and so on, and so you get writers who write with great economy because we know what things look like, whereas Zola's readers would not have known what the inside of a mine.
Yeah.
Coal mine would look like, or they wouldn't know what the inside of the stock exchange in Paris would look like. So he is literally describing it so that people can picture it.
Yeah.
But we don't need that anymore.
I'll also say, if people are put off by the length of Zola, there's a fantastic Radio 4 BBC drama adaptation which you can listen to, which if you want to.
Yeah. No, these things are provide a great way in, you know.
Absolutely. And we've spoken there about a couple of influences on your writing. Who are the others that maybe we haven't mentioned?
Yes, influence is a funny thing. I think people tend to be influenced by stuff that they read at a kind of early stage, you know. And I mean, I've been absolutely consumed by recently, and I wouldn't say it's an influence by like Annie Ernaux and her writing, which I just find beyond brilliant. And again, it has all those qualities of concision and, you know, this economy, and then this fantastic moments of insight. You know, the book I was just mentioning, Forbidden Notebook, there's a Belgian writer called Madeleine Bourdieu, or it's actually pronounced Bourdeux, I was told by an actual Belgian, who was a fairly unknown writer, existential writer, who wrote two novels called La Femme de Gilles and Marie, and they're absolutely stunning novels. And again, it's that precision and attention to domestic detail, like, you know, you're talking about the scene I wrote with Gorski cooking, and you know, I kind of wonder if it's sort of unconsciously, you know, I'm influenced by these scenes. Madeleine Bourdieu writes about, you know, the preparation of a meal and so on. I think, you know, you're not always conscious of stuff, and sometimes you realise you've written something and it's just like something you read like 20 years before. So yeah, I mean,
have you had people at book events come up to you, not just for this book but previous ones, and say, oh yeah, that was Camus or something like that?
I've had people come up and say, oh my god, you're so influenced by Patricia Highsmith. Oh, well, that's amazing, because I've never read any, you know, and that, but because people read stuff and it reminds them of stuff they've read, and they assume that you as the author must have read it too. Kafka is one. I mean, there are certain scenes, I would say there are certain scenes in this book, Case of Matricide, that I would say there's one scene that is absolutely influenced by a very important scene in Crime and Punishment. But I think this whole strand of narrative with the Slav, it feels to me like it's in the shadow of Kafka. Because Gorski finds himself humiliating himself by having to sort of enforce some regulations or laws which are plainly absurd. So it's almost like Kafka, not from the point of Joseph K, but from the point of view of Joseph K's accusers. I mean, the trial is to me one of them. I don't think there are many important novels. I don't, you know what I mean, but I think the trial is an important novel.
You mentioned earlier on about Raymond Brunet, who wrote these books and you discovered them. Can you talk a little bit about his role in matters?
Yeah, I mean, I got myself into a real fanco talking about this recently to another journalist. I need to get my story straight. So the story of Raymond Brunet is that after the publication of The Disappearance of Adele Badeau, which was filmed by Claude Chabrol, he failed to produce another novel and threw himself in front of a train. However, 20 years later, when his own mother died, two manuscripts appear at his publishers, which Brunet had written and insisted that could only be published upon the death of his mother. So those two manuscripts are The Accident on the A35 and A Case of Matricide. And they're both, in a way, they're almost auto-fictional novels, especially The Accident on the A35, because Raymond Brunet's father died in an accident on the A35, and the character in the novel, Raymond Barthelme, his father, he's 17, his father dies in an accident on the A35. So this is the accident on the A35 is a kind of auto-fictional sort of exploration of that incident in Raymond Brunet's own life. In the accident, in A Case of Matricide, we find the character of Robert Duiman, who is in a way Brunet's surrogate in this text, because he is a novelist. He's returned and he is living like Raymond Brunet with his mother in Saint Louis, and had once published a novel which was made into a film by Claude Chabrol. So
I just asked you that question to see if we could follow the time.
I'm actually quite pleased with my own explanation of that, and of course I as a translator of the books in this one, I, of course, being the rampant egotist I am, insert myself into the book, and there's an afterword in which I travelled to Saint Louis to explore whether about the authenticity of this text, A Case of Matricide.
And of course, the text, A Case of Matricide, is in the book itself, isn't it? The collection.
Yes, it is indeed. There is a manuscript
within
the book called A Case of Matricide.
What do you think you'll miss Gorski? And I mean, I know you can go to Saint Louis, but this Saint Louis, do you think you'll miss them?
I think when I was writing the book, and I found this book quite difficult to write. I mean, very difficult to write, partly because of the various narrative strands, and it's partly that sort of self-doubt that's always present, of like, why would anybody want to read this stuff, and that's why it's so nice when you mention this things I work really hard on, like he's cooking a piece of fish. It's a trilogy and it's over. I'll miss Saint Louis.
Yeah.
Although I'm unbelievably rude about the town, consistently so, but I felt I couldn't, because Raymond Brunet is rude about the town because he is trapped there. He can't bear the place. But I have a real fondness for that town now, and it's as you say, I can always go back, and I'm sure I will go back. Hopefully this book will be published in French, and that would provide it would be a nice bookend to go. And I've met a few people in Saint Louis now, one in particular. I've been to the lycée twice to talk to students there, and who made a brilliant film about the first book.
Fantastic!
Which I'll send you the link for.
Yeah.
And it's called Searching for Raymond Brunet, and the whole point of the film is like, what? Some Scottish guy's written a book about Saint Louis, and that is absolutely the reaction of everybody in the town. It's like so weird. I mean, it's like you grew up. Well, I come from Kilmarnock, so it's like if some French guy had come and written 3 books about Kilmarnock, you'd be like, well, why Kilmarnock? So there's a kind of mystification about it.
And you mentioned a couple of times that you don't plan anything, and again, I'm going to avoid all the spoilers, so if I do step over the line, let me know and take it out. But there's a shock in the book. Were you shocked when that came around?
I probably am aware of the moment you're talking about. There was one scene in the book that I knew I was going to write,
right,
and it was a kind of big central scene, a very big scene, I love writing the little scenes. I love the cooking of the fish, and the cooking of the fish gets every bit as much attention as the discovery of a dead body. In fact, I'm more interested in the cooking of the fish. But there was one scene. I don't plan the whole narrative, but I did have one scene in mind that was always going to be in the book, and it was. But I wrote it. I didn't write it until I reached it.
Yeah.
And I actually I went to Saint Louis for about just over a week. Stayed in an Airbnb, wandered around, sat in the bars, wondering what I was doing. This is very strange sort of thing to be doing. And but I wrote that scene while I was in Saint Louis.
Right.
And I felt it felt very right to do it. And I'm not somebody who writes huge screeds, on a daily basis. I try to write 1,000 words or something, but regularly, and not go into big splurges where you get exhausted and then don't write again for another 3 days. But I wrote this particular scene, and I drank some red wine, and I wrote 2,000 or 3,000 words, into the night, and
Yeah.
that's not my normal methodology, but it was almost like this is the climax of this entire project, and I've pictured that scene for a decade, probably, and now I'm writing it. So it's like I've waited a long time to write this scene.
So were you almost getting into character as the writer who would write this scene?
I was in character as Raymond Brunet writing this entire book.
Right, okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are, I'm writing Raymond Brunet's book, definitely. I'm writing in the voice of Raymond Brunet. I mean, there's a passage which again I read at the Edinburgh Festival, and which is completely inspired by Émile Zola, which is about the sort of social classes of the town and how they all look at each other and behave towards each other, and that is inspired by something Zola writes about the town of Plassans, where many of his novels are set. And I say things in that passage like the poor have no free will, but when I wrote it, I didn't think that is and it's also I don't think that.
Yeah.
I don't think me, Graeme Macrae Burnet, the actual author of the book. That's not what I think. This is what Raymond Brunet is writing.
Yeah.
And of course it creates a fantastic sort of arm's length distance to what you write as well, to write in that way. So yeah, when I came to write that scene, I suppose when it comes to the sort of emotional engagement with Gorski, I am Raymond Brunet, I'm him. I'm trying to be inside Gorski's head. I'm trying to feel what he feels, but it's a sort of climactic moment, both for the book and for me. Yeah.
Have you ever felt when people are talking to you about the book, the need to defend something that's in the book? You go, this is a fiction, because I think sometimes people get confused.
Oh well,
and particularly perhaps when you're putting extra layers of meta between.
Yeah. Well, the great excuse.
The great excuse.
Well, I mean, the book's not out yet, so I haven't really had reactions to this book yet. But in general, I mean, I felt it most strongly when I went to Saint Louis and did an event there they have a book festival, and at the time the first book had only just come out, so most people wouldn't have read it, and they wouldn't know that I was really rude. But somebody did ask me a question about me being so rude about the people of Saint Louis, because I paint Saint Louis as a place that if you don't leave, you're a failure, and the people who live there live with this burden of failure that they never escaped. And that, I could say that about my own town, but you can't say it about somebody else's, and somebody who lives there, could rightfully feel aggrieved. And my position is, I completely get it. You have every right to feel aggrieved and hate me. But I also said, I don't work for the tourist board, and as a writer, whatever you're writing about, you can't censor yourself. I mean, at least when you're writing your first drafts and so on, you have to go with and write the stuff that comes out of your head. You might decide later on that you're not comfortable publishing it, or you shouldn't publish it, or somebody might say, you can't really say that, or if you say this, you're going to get into trouble, just be prepared. But I think you lose authenticity as a writer if you start worrying about what people think. So we'll see how people respond. I haven't really had. I mean, I think you always just have to be prepared that people might take offence, or I don't think I would never set out to be offensive, but you have to be prepared and listen to people when they take exception to something you've written, and that has happened with various of my books. In His Bloody Project probably most. And I just, you just listen, and I think if you take people's grievances seriously, which I do, and give them a sincere answer, that's all you can do.
Yeah.
And if people understand that, even if they don't like what you've written, you haven't written it out of a desire to be offensive or to get on the wrong side of somebody, then they can still feel aggrieved. But you can't write. If you'd end up just writing stuff that's completely sanitized, And
yeah. Well, I hope we have piqued people's interest for A Case of Matricide and the trilogy as a whole. If you haven't read any of them, if you have, I'm sure you're going to want to read this final entry. But before we leave, there have been rumours of adaptations of His Bloody Project and Case Study. Can you confirm or deny? Feel free to deny. I don't mind.
I'm not going. I'm not. I mean, the rights for His Bloody Project have been sold and renewed for a decade now, pretty much. And
gosh, has it been that long?
Well, almost. Yeah. It'll be 10 years out next year.
Wow.
And you know, it's with a company in Glasgow called Synchronicity who are doing absolutely amazing mayflies.
Yeah.
And the Tutu About Switch, which is a tremendous achievement for a smallish production company in Scotland to make something of that scale, and it's had a tremendous impact. So hats off to them. Things are in development, and I'm not in any way naive about, you know, the pace of movement in these things is very, very slow. I would love there to be a film of His Bloody Project one day. I kind of think there will be,
right?
Because there's been I think there is a will to do it, but everything needs to get aligned. And similarly, I would actually love it more with Case Study, because I think there are two amazing roles for actors in that book, and I think it's a bit more accessible, you know, to a wider audience, but also just from a sort of slightly selfish point of view, His Bloody Project has really had a great life as a novel. Yeah, and I feel like Case Study, which I think is maybe the favourite of my books. Right. You know, I love that book. Yeah. You know, and you know, I think it kind of needs a little punty, as we would say in Ayrshire, from an adaptation, and it would be exciting to see. So, but you know, we shall see.
And can you say what you're working on next, or is it all about matricide at the moment? It's all about matricide.
I've had a bit of a hiatus. I've been doing some research, and I've got what I in my head call the big project, which I will probably start calling His Bloody Project.
My Bloody Project.
But it's in such an early stage that I'm going to keep it under wraps for a while. Yeah,
that gives us something to look forward to. Yeah. Graeme, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. It's always a pleasure. The book's out on the 3rd of October.
3rd of October, absolutely.
And the launch is at Waterston's in Glasgow.
Sauchiehall Street, and then Portobello Books, 15th of October.
And we'll put any other dates on the website. But thanks again.
Thanks again, Alistair. Always a pleasure.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.